This is A View from the Bunker. Now, here's Derek Gilbert.
The Christian heroes who defended the West against Islam. That's this week on A View from the Bunker. Imagine a wave of terror attacks across our country. Unexpected, shocking, deadly, and provoked by a single email. The government responds with lockdowns and lockups of anyone with unapproved ideas, and they add in mandatory vaccines. That's the premise behind my novel, The God Conspiracy. And your response to our special offer in the month of August was so overwhelming, and we are grateful for that we've decided to extend it. The God Conspiracy plus the theology behind the novel. 12 hours of our video teachings taken from presentations we've recorded over the last 5 years. 12 hours of video in all on 4 DVDs, all together, a $120 value. We're offering it to you during the month of September for just $35 plus shipping and handling. It's a compelling story that I hope you appreciate. But more than that, the video teachings on the long supernatural war in which we all play a part, from Eden to Armageddon. Take advantage of it now. Available online at the Gilbert House store, only gilberthouse.org. And we thank you for your prayers and your support. It's not a story that we often hear in the corporate media here in the West because it doesn't fit the narrative. See, Islam is a religion of peace, you see. Except that it's not. Our guest has been on this program several times before. We're happy to have him back because he's got a brand new book here. He's got a unique perspective on this history between Islam and the West. In fact, one of his books devoted to that cause. He's born and raised in the United States to parents of Egyptian ancestry who were born and raised in the Middle East. So he's got a unique perspective there. He is a Christian, currently serves as the Shillman Fellow, a Shillman Fellow at the David Horowitz Freedom Center, Distinguished Senior Fellow at the Gatestone Institute, Judith Friedman Rosen Fellow at the Middle East Forum, and he's the author of a couple of books that we highly recommend: Crucified Again, Exposing Islam's New War on Christians, Sword and Scimitar, 14 Centuries of War Between Islam and the West, and the new book, the subject of our discussion today, Defenders of the West, the Christian Heroes Who Stood Against Islam. We're honored to welcome back to the program Raymond Ibrahim. Raymond, it's good to have you back on the program, and we mentioned before we started recording here, I hadn't planned on this, but this is going out and being released on the 11th of September, which most of us Americans would associate with a specific event in 2001, but actually you wrote quite a bit about an event on September 11th. So I remember it's 1683. Was that the year?
Yeah, the Battle of Vienna, the Great Siege. The Ottoman Turks had surrounded and were choking Vienna in Austria, and which was really the capital of the Holy Roman Empire. So it was pretty significant at the time. And the siege had been going on for months, and it's pretty horrific stuff. It's what you expect from sieges, dysentery and pestilence and death all around. And then on that date, September 11th, or as some sources put it, September 12th. It depends, does the charge begin at night? Does it enter the next day? But that's when John Sobieski, the Polish king, with a coalition of other, Germans and so forth, came down from the hill and, waged battle. And as usual, when it came to Christians versus Muslims, the Christians were outnumbered vastly, but they actually, they were victorious. They beat the Muslims and routed the Ottomans, and the siege came to an end. It's actually a very important day. And again, it's unfortunate we don't remember these things. They're just dates. They mean nothing. But, the whole of Christendom could have been, snuffed out right then and there, because if you took Vienna, that's it. All of Europe is, open to you. And that was actually the goal for the Ottomans for centuries.
Yeah, it must have been an amazing sight. I mean, as a fan of the Lord of the Rings movies, the charge of the oh my goodness! The Rohirrim. Yes, the Rohirrim charging down there. It was just an amazing sight. But you can imagine something like that happening for real with Sobieski and his winged hussars flying down the hill at these stunned Ottomans who were like, "Where did these guys come from?" Just as they were breaking through the walls of Vienna.
Yeah, it's actually interesting because Tolkien, who himself, of course, was a Christian. It's very clear that he borrowed a lot of things from this long war between Christendom and Islam. The Battle of the Hornburg, which again is the Rohirrim, That is, I believe, largely based on this battle Covadonga from the 8th century, when the Muslims were attacking a small remnant of Christian Spaniards up in the northwest caves. Literally, Covadonga means the cave of the lady, and they were outnumbered, and it was a very heroic final kind of they burst out just like in the movie and actually routed the Muslims. So yeah, men like Tolkien were definitely aware of that long history. The siege of Gondor is very much similar to the siege of Constantinople. Even in the details, I think it would be great if someone, unless they have already, create a documentary or a book showing all these parallels between, how Tolkien was really thinking in these, civilizational conflicts which he himself experienced.
That's, I think you may have just invented a new project for yourself. Your new book, Defenders of the West, Sobieski's not in the book, but you cover him quite extensively in Sword and Scimitar. But you select 8 other defenders of the West. And as you pointed out in our previous interviews, the term the West was invented because that's what was left of Christendom after the armies of Islam got done taking the Levant, taking the Holy Land, taking most of the Mediterranean. Why did you choose specifically these 8 men?
Yeah, that's a great question, which I discussed at some length in the introduction because I think it's a valid question. So to start with, all 8 men were to me pretty innately interesting from my earlier readings and studies and so forth. And there's certainly no dearth of what I classify as Christian heroes who fought and resisted and stood against Islam. But some of the considerations that came into play were, for example, I would have wanted to write something about Charlemagne, or Charles Martel, and both of them are actually in my previous book, Sword and Scimitar. But there's just not enough source material to do them justice in a full chapter. In this book, I allot anywhere between 30 and 40 pages, most of which is derived from primary sources. So that was definitely a consideration to try to, and that's why when you look at the book, the characters who come in the 15th century, I think you're going to find those chapters are a little more colorful because we just have so much more sources as opposed to the very earliest chapters, which I even discuss this is not to take away from, the valor of the fellows in the first chapters, because I think they were even more determined in their obstinacy vis-a-vis Islamic jihad, if you read between the lines. But so there were a lot of different factors of why. But in the end, to be honest with you, I picked these men because out of the vast array of characters that I drew with my wide net originally before I started writing, they were originally my favorites for various reasons. And I thought it was also good because they really cover the entire theater of war between Islam and Christendom. You got 2 chapters from Spain with the Reconquista and all that's going on there. You got 3 chapters in the Balkans, of course, with the Ottoman, as we discussed with the Siege of Vienna. And you got 3 chapters of the Holy Land, of course, which is the only form of military conflict between Christendom and Islam from a historical perspective that most Westerners know about, the Crusades. But, again, as with the other book, in this book, I just try to emphasize the Crusades were really almost like a drop in the bucket of really the long war between Islam and Christendom. And they're just emphasized simply because they make Christians look like the aggressor. Mm-hmm. But if you really look at in the long continuum, they're just a small slither, two centuries of literally almost 14 centuries of mostly Muslims going on the offensive.
One of the other issues that you address in the introduction, and I want to bring that out here, is your use of primary sources. You quote extensively and sometimes very lengthy bits of description from contemporaries or near contemporaries of the men that you write about. Why did you lean so heavily on primary sources?
I'm a big fan of primary sources. That's, as I say, that's straight from the horse's mouth. And I'm tired of reading secondary sources by well-known historians who don't even bother to give you a footnote. And it's like you're just supposed to believe them because they have all these letters behind their names or they're popular or whatever. And I've also often found, having consulted the primary sources, that oftentimes these secondary sources written by these acclaimed academics and scholars and whoever actually don't have any foundation as opposed to what they claim. I mean, I've actually, but how many people will do that? Will actually read Karen Armstrong or John Esposito and then go and try to find but you're in the minority and so on, right? And that's their strategy. But when you go in and you look, it's kind of, and I've given you extreme examples. Karen Armstrong, she's a renowned apologist, but even those who just seem neutral, and you go and you look, and it's sometimes just not there what they're talking about, or it's really distorted for an obvious agenda, conscious or unconscious. I don't know. So that's why I always lean heavy, as I say in the introduction. I don't expect, unlike those people, I don't expect anyone to take my word on it. And that's why in this book, in Defenders of the West, you're going to see, I think, 1,200 endnotes, citations. Not all to primary sources, but they're at least to something. Secondary, some of them, because I want the reader to know I'm not making this up. And which leads to a really interesting point that even though I'm not making any of this up, and I found it written somewhere, the narrative itself is just so exciting that any of these chapters, I think, could become a movie by themselves.
Yes.
Without having to fake it. We're used to Hollywood. Hollywood has to create, fictitious tales to interest us. I think these, as objective as they are and based on primary sources, are even more sensational. And it's the whole idea of truth is stranger than fiction. Right?
This could be a fascinating docuseries, an 8-part docuseries, 1 week spent on each of these 8 men. This would be a really fascinating thing. So let's dive into some of these. We won't have time to cover many of these. And to be honest with you, I'm only 2.5 chapters in, but I'm familiar with a couple of the other guys here that you cover. But digging deep into a couple of these that maybe we've heard of, but not really, but we've been getting the secondary source modern scholarship version of, for example, Godfrey of Bouillon, who was among the First Crusade and a leader in the First Crusade. And of course, we've been taught that the Crusades were bad, Christian aggression against the Muslims who've always lived in the Holy Land. It's like, wait a minute. No, wait. That was Christian territory until the 7th century. Duke Godfrey. Who was Godfrey and what made him so exceptional?
Yeah, Godfrey to me is one of the most impressive. And he's chapter 1. And so he does come from that era that I was mentioning where we have somewhat of a dearth of actual sources. We have a lot, of course, on the First Crusade, which he's in, but we don't have the close panoramic kind of view of who Godfrey was. So I really had to do a lot of researching and piece together his life from various sources. We have a lot of sources in the Crusades, but you will find just a small bit of him here, there, and so forth. But I think I was able to, I managed to put a narrative together. But Godfrey basically is known as one of the first leaders of the First Crusade. One of the main leaders. There's about 5 or so. You have Bohemond and Tancred, his nephew, the Normans. You got Raymond of Toulouse from France, or basically they're all Franks in the Muslim mind. And you have many others. But he was what I find. And so to me, the real question was, I'm going to do a First Crusader. Who do I pick? There were a lot that were very interesting. But I picked him in the end because I just was really impressed with, he really fused piety, with militancy. So, for example, Bohemond, another famous, arguably more famous than Godfrey, wanted to fight the Byzantine or Eastern Roman Emperor.
Right,
because
right.
The Catholic, Orthodox, all that. And he told Godfrey, join me right when they were going on the Crusades. Of course, they all stopped in Constantinople. And Bohemond said, let's attack him to help further the crusade. Godfrey said, I have the quote in the book, but he said something to paraphrase, I will not turn arms pledged to the infidel against Christians, or something to that effect. And that's really the whole tenor of who Godfrey was all throughout. He's always at the forefront of the attacks, fighting. He's always the one who's being modest and not, taking advantage of certain situations. There's I don't want to give too much away, and I don't want to be a spoiler because there's a lot of interesting adventures, but one of them features a bear attack. He was actually trying to help a fellow Christian in the mountains when they were all starving, as is famously known in the First Crusade, before they reached Antioch, and that debilitated him for months, and he was near dead. Came back, continued the good fight. Essentially, he was the first to, after Antioch was conquered, which was a major, watershed moment for the First Crusade, he was the first to head out again for the original purpose, which is liberating Jerusalem, the Holy Land. And, long story short, after, the First Crusaders took Jerusalem, the great feats of arms that he committed there. And then, they had a council, we need a king, right? And he was one of those who was elected by the rank and file. And one of the election processes, was the electors actually questioned the followers of the various men that were put up to be king. And when they came to Godfrey's men, their main complaint, and this is after having taken an oath and swearing, is that he just spent too much time talking to monks when they would visit an abbey or a church, that their meal got cold. And so they were really annoyed. And then it really culminates with, so the crown is given to him, but he refuses being called king. And he says, I refuse to wear a crown of gold where my Lord wore a crown of thorns.
Wow.
So you really, that line of piety, medieval style, really runs through his life from beginning to end. It's interesting about him, too, because he's what a lot of scholars point to as the bad guy. They talk about second sons when they talk about the Crusades, which means you didn't have land because of primogeniture and your father, the oldest son gets everything. So he was a second son, but he actually did have quite a lot of possessions, and he gave a lot of them away, and he sold others to raise money for the crusade. And again, I don't want to ruin it, but he didn't live too long to enjoy being. Yeah, like I said, he didn't take the term king. He called himself the guardian of the Holy Sepulchre, or the defender, which is very apt for my book, Defenders of the West. Yeah,
Godfrey's life really illustrates something that you mentioned early in the book, that in the Middle Ages, Christianity was considered a rather muscular faith. It was not this baby Jesus, meek and mild kind of faith that was considered important. There was a priority that was placed on liberating Jerusalem. And it was like Jerusalem was part of our territory as we, the inheritors of the faith, we let it fall into the hands of infidels. We have to go get it back, just as you wouldn't allow the enemy to come and take the capital city of your nation or your dukedom. Or there was a different view of Christianity back then. I mean, I guess the idea of Augustine's just war was really pondered a lot more than we modern day Christians. And oddly enough, we in modern America, conservative American Christians tend to be very supportive of our nation and our military, and yet our military ventures today are fought for very different reasons. You comment on that just a little bit in the introduction to the book. How would somebody like Godfrey have looked on modern day politicians and what we prioritize as war-worthy?
Yeah, that's a great observation. Something that, and I do discuss it a bit in the introduction, but definitely we can wax on that philosophically. But basically, the Christians of the pre-modern era, as I call them, just war theory was a serious thing. Okay, you can love the enemy, but you got to hate the sin, all right, and you fight it and you combat it. You're not a doormat. I think the problem is so much of Christianity today has been turned into what I call a doormat form of Christianity. And this really runs through all the denominations. It's not any particular denomination. It's the Geist, it's the spirit, it's the worldview of this era, which is that to be a Christian, your job is to turn the other cheek, and it's to be essentially a doormat, and you never judge. Who are you to judge? And that just was never the case for centuries, okay, including with Protestants in the very early centuries. This is a modern phenomenon, I think. And, I associate it. I find it interesting, when you watch the media and you listen to especially secular worldly types, oftentimes the most, avowed enemies of Christianity are the ones who go out of their way to pontificate to Christians about the need to love their enemy. Okay, it's very self-serving. And sadly, too many Christians fall for it. And I think a great amount of Christians also, make a virtue of their cowardice. They pretend to be tolerant and forgiving, but they're just, anti-confrontational, and they don't want to rock the boat. That's who they really are. So, yeah, there's a vast difference between the men that I cover, as I call them, the defenders of the West, who without them, and it's funny, today's, our day and age, including Christians, will mock these men and get angry at me for even calling them Christians. These were the men who embodied what's today dismissed and condemned as toxic masculinity, patriarchy, racism. I mean, these guys were just brewing with what would be called that. Of course, that's not what they were. Yeah, they were definitely masculine, and that's what's called toxic masculinity. Just regular masculinity is toxic today. And they had their priorities straight. So as you say, for them going and recovering their holy territories, okay, and also, and it's always emphasized that they went on the crusade to just liberate the sepulchre and so forth. But actually, the twin aim was to help Christians, to help their Eastern co-religionists who were literally in the years and decades before the First Crusade were being massacred by the tens of thousands, and churches were being burned by the thousands, all in Asia Minor and in the Holy Land. So, to them, they're not going to be doormats. Okay, you have to stand for what's right. Okay, that's the idea was they stood for what's right. So it was a happy balance between you, and this is the whole idea of just war theory, which was very prominent in the medieval era, which is, sure, I as an individual can turn the other cheek, I can forgive, and I should as a Christian, but law and order has to reign in society. And so that's sort of what they believed. And that's what what led them to do what they did, which is fight against a hostile Islamic force on these various theaters of war that I discussed.
Yeah, it's a real contrast between what you describe in your book here and modern day Western democracies that are willing to go to Afghanistan and fight for the right of girls to go to school, but not a word is said about the Christians of northern Iraq, the Christians of Iraq in general. After we went in 2003, it went from like 2 million Christians down to about 125,000. And it only became an issue in around 2015, as I recall, just as it became clear that the American public was really getting sick of being in that. Hey, we have to go defend the Christians. Really, what's been going on there? Because on our watch, with our troops in country, the Christians in Iraq were decimated. We weren't doing a very good job of defending them. And again, you just have to wonder what men like Duke Godfrey would have to say about our politicians.
And that's just it. We here in the modern West, you can condemn, what primitive superstition nonsense they went to fight for a so-called Holy Land. Well, look at what we fight for,
Yeah.
I mean, what are we fighting for? I mean, it's especially if you're a Christian, you got to look at what your government's doing, and it's not fighting for anything that's holy.
No, that's a fact.
It's like the opposite often.
You mentioned a couple of men in Spain, and again, this is something that most Christians aren't familiar with. I've done some presentations on my book, Bad Moon Rising, and show on a map where Charles Martel put a stop to things in 732 at the Battle of Toulouse. Was it? Tours. And if he'd, if the Muslim advance had continued, they may well have crossed the English Channel. And things would have been very, very different for us here in the United States, being the descendant of, some Englishmen who decided to flee the country back in the 17th century. There's a gentleman you write, chapter 2 of your book, devoted to a guy who I've seen. I seem to remember like a movie or television series where El Cid, but he was nothing like what I thought. Again, the impression I had is very different from what's in your book. What was his real name, and why did the Muslims call him El Cid or the Cid?
Right. So we're talking about in the colloquial Spanish, Rodrigo Diaz de Vivar from Vivar in Spain. Or Roderick, really, to give him his earlier, more Anglican name, because this is the time of the Visigoths becoming Spaniards, so it gets all mixed up. At any rate, you're alluding to Charlton Heston movie, the famous
right.
I think 1960 whatever, El Cid, and and again you see it. I mean, back then in the 60s, okay, you have these woke elements because of course it's Hollywood, and so what they really emphasize in that movie is how El Cid. Rodrigo is very sort of tolerant. He's not a jingoist. He's not very proactive about his Christianity. He's very welcoming and tolerant of Muslims, and the bad guys are the other Christians who are all about crusading and Reconquista and all that. Okay, like Alfonso VI, the Spanish king of the time. But when you read, and again, it's like there's a kernel of truth in that, but it's really pulled out of context. So yeah, of course, Spain really was a very interesting microcosm of the Islamic Christian sort of jihad Reconquista thing for centuries. And there was this thing going on Islam was in the mid to southern half, and the Christians were in the mid to northern half of Spain. And the more north you went in the Spanish-controlled areas known as El Andalus, which comes from the Vandals, actually, and that's a whole interesting etymology. But anyway, if you go up halfway through, they were actually very much mixed with the Christians, including racially. A lot of these caliphs, someone did a study, and the final Umayyad caliph in the 11th century was apparently less than 1% Arab. Because what the caliphs did, of course, is they would marry Spaniard, European harem women, and they would have a son, and then the son would be split in half.
Yeah, I was
exponentially.
I was so surprised by that I actually highlighted that. It was like a 0.009%, I think, is the figure. I mean, that's like, what?
Right, but it really sheds light onto why there was some sort of cooperation between the northern Moors, as they were called, or Muslims, and the Christians. They were actually very similar racially, and it's also well known that during this era, the Muslims, especially in that region, were very nominal. Okay, they were what you would call a moderate Muslim today. Yeah. So you had some sorts of alliances going on between these various Christian kingdoms and the Muslims, but when it really got ugly, and then the Moors called for a pristine Islamic group from North Africa, the Almoravids, as they're called, which comes from an Arabic word that means the men who man, basically the jihadists. That's what they were. They were what you would call today a radical ISIS type group. They actually dressed in pure black, and their eyes. Actually, the movie El Cid gets that right, because that's how they appear, always dressed in black, and so forth, and screaming Allah Akbar, that sort of thing. Once those entered into Spain and all the Muslims joined forces with them, then the Cid completely changed, and there was no more toleration. And he was very, very openly pro-Christian, and But what makes him really important, and one of the earliest medieval poems from Europe is all about his life, which is very interesting because in that era you had epics only about kings, and he wasn't. He was actually a lesser noble. So it just shows you how influential he was. And when if you read the chapter, chapter 2, the battles that he was in, just single-handedly with a small handful of men, and he would just fight the most ferocious jihadist group that I mentioned from North Africa, and he would time and time again defeat them and disgrace them. And again, always, there's an undertone of Christianity versus Islam. This isn't just some war about territory. There's the ideological religious component. And it's with El Cid too. So that's why, very interesting character, definitely belonged in this book on Defenders of the West. But he's one of those guys because he is so popular historically that Hollywood had to turn its attention to, and then they watered him down into something palatable to our sensibilities.
And his time frame, and just to give people a sense of where this is happening in history, he was the latter part of the 11th century.
Yeah, he's actually contemporary with the First Crusade with Godfrey.
Okay.
They lived at the same time. He's probably 15 years older than Godfrey. And actually, it's known that during, I think, July 15th, 1099 is when the Crusaders reconquered Jerusalem in the name of Christianity. And the only shadow of gloom during that week is that's when the Cid died, the same week.
The Cid was so popular during his lifetime that caused some problems with King Alfonso. What was going on there with Alfonso and his court that he just couldn't stand having the Cid around?
Yeah, and the movie, the 60s movie, actually sort of reflects that. Alfonso VI was actually, he's credited formally with being the man who starts the Reconquista. In 1085, he reconquered Toledo, which is right in the center of Spain, and which had been under Islamic control since the Islamic invasion in 711 in the early 8th century. And it was actually the capital of the Visigoths. So in reconquering it, it had an impact on everyone, Muslim and Christian. It was very symbolic and so forth. So he himself is known as one of the major players. But the Cid, his lowly vassal, always outshone him fighting against the Muslims. And on at least 2 occasions, Alfonso exiled him. And there's always a pretext, okay? But according to, if you read between the lines, he just was jealous. And the Cid was a sort of headstrong man that earlier he served Alfonso's older brother, Sancho. But then Sancho was killed, and this is also in the movie. And there was some rumors that Alfonso was responsible. He helped assassinate his brother so he could become king. And Cid, before pledging his loyalty to Alfonso, forced him publicly to put his hand on a Bible and swear 3 times that he had nothing to do with the killing of his brother, and that if he was lying, he would go to eternal hell. So, he was definitely a formidable character.
So after the Cid died, what happened in Spain? How did the situation change?
So, yeah, as you point out, this is the 11th century, late 11th century. And after he dies, actually, the Muslim, jihad makes a comeback. And all the gains that he had made quickly crumble because, that, again, shows you his own singular ability to be a great, essentially warlord. But at that point now, there was no end to men who would wage the Reconquista. And you get king after king and noble after noble. This is all they do because with the Almoravids, it became, there was some semblance of cooperation after the 8th century Islamic conquest, because like I said, there was a sort of assimilation going on. But when these new Muslims came from Africa, and the first wave is the Almoravids, but then a second wave comes, which is even more radical, the Almohads, which comes from the term al-Muwahhidin. When you see ISIS do the finger, the oneness of Allah, that's what they are named, Mohad, one, okay? So very, very radical group. And here again we see in compare and contrast with the modern era. What did the Christians of northern Spain do? They didn't sue for peace, they didn't appease or anything. They actually just fought back, fire with fire, and very violent conflicts in those early 12th and 13th centuries. And it's interesting because in many ways it culminates in chapter 4 of the book with a descendant of the Cid, which is Ferdinand III of Castile, known as Saint Ferdinand, or or in California, San Fernando in Texas. That's that's what they're named after, right? And another man who was so committed to the Reconquista, to reclaiming Spain for Christianity, to ejecting Islamic intolerance and all, because the stuff that we talk about today, killing blasphemers, attacking Salman Rushdie, that sort of thing was embedded in the history of wherever Islam was, except it was even more graphic, and it was on display in Spain as well. I get a lot. There's so much to talk about there, but really, a lot can be said about Saint Ferdinand, but I'll leave it there. But he definitely helped spearhead the Reconquista and more or less brought it to a close.
Ferdinand was also related through marriage to another gentleman in the book here, King Richard the Lionheart. Now, all I know really about Richard the Lionheart is either from the Disney cartoon, where King John is an evil sniveling lion or whatever.
And Robin Hood.
And Robin Hood, right. But also in The Lion in Winter, where he's played by Anthony Hopkins.
Peter O'Toole. Oh, no, yeah.
Peter O'Toole plays Henry. Wonderful movie, but again, you don't get much of the sense of what Richard is really about, and they portray him in a way that's perhaps not consistent with his martial abilities.
Well, let's look at one point in that movie, and like you, I really like that movie. I don't like the rendering of Richard. They actually portray him as a homosexual. Yeah, and this is in the 60s, and that actually goes back to a scholarly interpretation that began literally maybe in 1960. That's the first inkling that you get any word about Richard being a homosexual. And what's it based on? Well, it's based on the fact that even though he was married, he never had any children, even though he did have one illegitimate son. Okay. So I suppose that means every barren man is now a homosexual, according to this idea. And also because, back in those days, it was common for two men or boys to sleep in the same bed, in which he did with his contemporary Francis, yeah. I'm sorry. King Philip. Philip II.
Right.
Philip II. So and that's what they play up in the movie, that they have this torrid love affair. And, nothing like that. And when you look at, and I actually quote real scholars who address this issue, but when you look at the primary sources of who Richard was, I mean, you want to talk about toxic masculinity or like just overflowing with testosterone. He, of all the characters in my book, of the 8, I think he's the most brutal and just like a juggernaut. And this comes from the sources, but it comes from the Muslim sources, which is really interesting. I mean, they themselves highlight that he was basically a mountain of a man that would be the first into the fray before his own men, and he's the king. And he would just butcher, dozens of Muslims at one conflict. So he was, a very fierce warrior. And also another popular idea of Richard is he's not really religious. He's not really into Christianity. It's kind of like he just wants to fight and have a good time. Well, no, that's not what the sources say. Again, the one I discussed a bit of it, but one notable point is in the very end, he was told as part of the treaty with Saladin that he could visit the Holy Land, and no problems. But he said, I will not take as a gift from the infidels what God will not give me. I have to liberate it, or I'm not even going to enter it. So Richard, very interesting character. Again, not like some of the people in the book, okay, like El Cid and Richard. We sort of, the popular culture knows them. They're just not like that in the book at all. Again, based on primary sources, and you see why, because they don't want you to know the truth, which is that these men were moved by their religion, that these men were noble, that they were these were kings. Ferdinand, for example, and Richard were kings who had a lot to live for, and they could have just sent their men, but they were always in the forefront fighting. And it's just a reflection of their self-sacrifice for their faith and what they believed.
You've got, and we're only going to scratch the surface of the book here, but that's good, because I really encourage people to get a copy of Defenders of the West and read it, because you're right. Each one of these chapters could be a standalone movie, and clearly some of these gentlemen have been the focus of, been featured in films. Probably not done justice based on what I've been reading so far in the primary sources. But I did notice the last three chapters all deal with the Balkans. John Hunyadi, I'm not familiar with. Skanderbeg, I'm not familiar with, but we'll get to the last guy here in just a minute. But why so much attention on the Balkans? What was it historically that made that such a point of contention between Christendom and Islam?
Well, so from the very start in the 7th century, Islam was, of course, a conquering creed through the jihad, and it absorbed and swallowed up all this Christian territory from all of North Africa, from Egypt to Morocco, and of course Southwest Asia, what we call the Middle East, Syria, Greater Syria, which encompassed Israel and Lebanon, and even portions of Iraq. So after that, all that was left. Unlike the Crusaders were ideologically driven, so they just went straight to one point, Jerusalem, the Holy Land, which meant they were always surrounded by enemies. Okay, but the jihad was smarter. It was basically whatever we're closest to, we're going to attack, absorb, consolidate, then attack the next infidel that abuts against our region. So once all of North Africa and the Middle East was taken, all that was left was Asia. The next on the picking list was Asia Minor. Of course, in the West, Spain had been conquered, and you had what we were discussing, the Reconquista. But so now the Turks are the standard bearers of the jihad, and they conquer Asia Minor. And then what's next after Asia Minor? Well, you're in Europe now properly, which is the Balkans. So that became the next, contested field. And the Ottomans, they went in and for centuries conquered and annexed a lot of these, European. And it's interesting because you understand now why the southeastern or Eastern European countries are none too fond of Islam as opposed to Western Europe. They actually have a very recent history under Islam. Some of these countries like Romania were under Islamic occupation for about 4 centuries. But in the book, I talk about the earlier portions of this when Islam was entering and advancing into the Balkans. And that's where these various heroes that you mentioned, such as John Hunyadi and Skanderbeg, emerge. And it's interesting because Skanderbeg is Hunyadi very much, but Skanderbeg is probably historically the most celebrated Christian hero. If you spoke about a Christian hero vis-a-vis Islam, it was actually Skanderbeg. There's thousands of books were written about him in Europe, and he was, widely praised. And when you read the chapter, you'll see why, because he essentially, he was abducted as a child. Of course, he was Christian. He's Albanian. Mm-hmm. His real name is George Castrioti, and he was abducted and turned into a janissary, which, as you know, is a Islamic slave soldier who's indoctrinated, forced into Islam, circumcised, trained to be a jihadist, and then let loose on his former kin. So he was trained into that, rose in the highest echelons of the military, became a general, had large contingents of Ottomans under his control. And when the time was right, he actually broke free of the Ottomans and went and returned back to the Albania and became their leader. And it's interesting, you see in the books his dialogues of how, he explains how he was always Christian at heart, but the only way to survive, his brothers were also taken captive and they were all killed under the Ottomans. He was possibly sexually molested because, and I discussed that a bit in the book, that was a very popular thing amongst the sultans. But he broke away free. He left all the wealth and power that he had there as an adult and as a general. And he ended up, he's called the Albanian Braveheart. So the William Wallace story, it's very similar. He just lived in caves with his people, fought with the Ottomans, always outnumbered 1 to 10, 1 to 20, and always prevailed due to his military genius and just his leadership. Very interesting character.
It's one that we're not familiar with here in the West. Again, I'd never heard of Skanderbeg, and I'm looking forward to reading through this over the next few days. As I've been trying to catch up on other projects, I've not had the opportunity to dive deeply past the first couple of chapters here, but your writing, and this is true of Sword and Scimitar as well, is very captivating, and your use of the primary sources really illuminates a period of history that most of us are ignorant about. I was really curious, really interested to see that the final chapter in your book is devoted to Vlad the Impaler. Not a guy that most of us would consider a Christian because of the way he's been fictionalized, courtesy of Bram Stoker, who interestingly is a character that Sharon has brought into her fiction series, the Red Wing Saga. But as most of us know him as Count Dracula. So how is it that he winds up in Defenders of the West?
Well, as you say, he's a great example of how, you have a historical character and then slowly he's turned and transformed to something that he doesn't really represent. So as you say, how he's in a book called The Christian Heroes Who Stood Against Islam. I thought he was a monster. Well, okay, there's some room for that, and I get into all the facts. But long story short, he's another Romanian prince who, with his brother, is submitted as a hostage to the Ottoman Turks and held in essentially a fortress in prison. He watches his brother become a catamite of Muhammad II or Mehmed II, the Sultan. Essentially, it's very graphic. How he molests him, and I assume the same thing happened to Dracula or Vlad. Anyway, when he like Skanderbeg, when he could, he broke away from them, even though he was essentially being groomed. What the Ottomans would always do is they would take Christian princes and groom them after humiliating them and making them pure dependents on them, and then set them as puppets and return them back to their kingdoms. In this case, Wallachia. But he broke away free from that and became his own king, or as it's called, voivode or warlord of Wallachia. And what's really interesting about him is just the way he just slapped the Ottomans in their face left and right. Every time they try to win him over, placate him, manipulate him, he just would not, in any way give in. And there's so many different anecdotes of what he did. And so one of the more famous anecdotes which I bring in is Muhammad sends his emissaries to basically threaten Vlad and tell him, you better start paying jizya, tribute, and you better submit your children to become janissaries, because they were collecting janissaries from the Romanians or the Wallachians at the time. And the first thing Vlad says to these emissaries, how come you don't remove your turbans in my presence? Don't you know I'm royalty? And they say, well, it's our religious custom. So he actually had the turbans nailed into their heads and said, well, since it's your custom, I'm going to help you maintain it. So that's the kind of guy he was. I mean, so definitely dark sense of humor. As far as what made him really popular, which is part of his moniker, Vlad the Impaler or Tsepish, he learned that from the Ottomans, and that's what you're not told. So we're told, oh, Vlad the Impaler, he impaled people. They don't tell you that he learned that from the Ottomans during his time as a hostage, and he was essentially fighting fire with fire, because that's what the Ottomans were doing to all of their enemies. Moreover, it was a common thing back then. It was even other Christian powers, would use impalement. It was a recognized form of, execution. So be that as it may, it doesn't really make him the monster that you would think, because in his historical context, that was kind of normal, believe it or not. But anyway, long story short, he had a lot of enemies, including amongst, Christians. And, his life is during the time of the Gutenberg press. And his life is in many ways the first example of fake stories or fake news, because what his enemies did is they took the accounts of what he did, which is impale people and which was cruel, but they really colored it and went out of their way to exaggerate. And that's where you get if you look at the sources, it's called, it's the Saxons from Transylvania who created this in the Hungarian king's court. But if you look at the sources, I mean, the things that they attributed to him, just really vile, bizarre, insane, sadistic things, which your average objective historian doesn't buy into them. It was propaganda. Yeah, he impaled, and he engaged in both, by our standards, his cruelty, like everyone else. At any rate, but he was, again, a very ferocious fighter. And in the book, I actually came across, accidentally, the primary source that gave rise to this idea that, he was like a black cloud flying like a bats, which you see in Hollywood movies. Yeah. It's actually in one of the battles that he went in trying to assassinate the Sultan because they invaded Romania, something like 150,000 men against 10,000 Wallachians. So, he decided to cut the head of the snake. And one night, with his men and with torches, he barged into the Ottoman camp looking to find the Sultan's head. And he almost got it, but he didn't. So really, again, very colorful character. But again, so if you look at his life, he's pious according to the standards of the time. He spent a lot of time in monasteries. He spent a lot of money to upkeep monasteries, including Mount Athos, and churches. So, and whenever he would execute someone, he would make sure he'd give them Christian rites. So, very, very interesting contradiction, but again, not that contradictory when you put it in context.
Interesting that he was a sponsor of Mount Athos. I understand that his namesake, Vlad Putin, visited Mount Athos in 2015. It took him a few tries to get there. Weather and other things got in the way, but that's not something, again, that most Christians here in the West are familiar with, and how Putin has sort of changed the religious temperature of Russia since. Not arguing that he's a good guy, again, this is an aspect of news and history that most of us in the West are not used to looking at. I'm just curious, John Hunyadi and Vlad, or at least Vlad's father, were contemporaries. What was there a relationship between the two of them? If so, how did they get on?
Sure. So Hunyadi has his own chapter. Again, another very impressive warrior. He became the governor and regent of Hungary. He was one of the first who took the offensive to the Turks, which was unheard of back then. You're just happy to know that they're leaving you alone or you're defending yourself. But he would, in the middle of winter, when no one was expecting it, mobilize his men and go and invade Ottoman territory and completely. In fact, I was telling you about Skanderbeg. Skanderbeg broke away from the Ottomans during a time when Hunyadi was attacking the Ottomans, and therefore he provided him with the opportunity. Not that they knew each other at the time. Mm-hmm. So, very impressive man. The siege of Belgrade, and I don't want to ruin this for people, but a lot of these men, they all die in their 40s and 50s, some 30s, despite being nobles and kings and lords, because of just the way they threw themselves, with great violence to defy the Islamic jihad. Yeah. And definitely Hunyadi's one of them. As far as as I was saying, earlier, the Ottomans had this trick where they would take and groom Christian princes. And they did that with Vlad's father, Vlad Tepes, Vlad the Impaler, who's also named Vlad II. Our Vlad, Dracula is the third. And Hunyadi, of course, they're from the same area, Transylvania, John Hunyadi and both Vlads, father and son. At one point, Hunyadi could not take it anymore with the vacillation of Vlad, the father of Dracula. And eventually an uprising occurred, which John Hunyadi was supposed to be behind, and he was ousted, Dracula's father. But apparently Hunyadi helped his son, our Dracula, the Impaler, come into power. So and that's one of the things that I encountered in writing this. It's never clear cut. You have a lot of, just a lot of nuances going on, inner politics between these various Christian kingdoms and so forth. Which is not unlike today.
No. And you go into that quite a bit in Sword and Scimitar, where it's clear in some of the battles that took place, the key battles in this 14th century ongoing conflict, that had the forces of Christendom been a little more united. Yeah, but you see that pattern over and over again. I mean, if the Celtic tribes had been a little more united when the Angles and Saxons came in, it might still be Britain instead of Angleland, and the same here in the United States when the white man came across the Appalachians. If Tecumseh had been able to hold the tribes together, things might be very different here today. It's fascinating history, and it's not the mainstream history of that we normally get from, apologists. Again, I read Karen Armstrong just to get a sense for what a mainstream historian was saying. And it's almost comical the way she defends Muhammad's change of tactics with things after 10 years of evangelizing weren't going well. And suddenly if we start, camel raids, we keep all the stuff and get all the women. And that's what Allah wants you to do. Hey, that worked. And she defends it as saying, well, they were a bunch of merchants. They didn't have any other way to make a living. So they had to raid the... Really? Well, anyway.
Muhammad is a prophet for our time. That's the title of her book. That's a prophet for our time.
Well, sadly, she's probably right about that, but maybe not in the way she thinks. The book is Defenders of the West. Raymond Ibrahim is the author. It is just again, fascinating work, and I've read Sword and Scimitar twice, and will no doubt read this again. Looking forward to getting deeper into the chapters on the Balkans, because that starts getting into the area where, well, as you wrote about in Sword and Scimitar, the Protestant Reformation, Martin Luther, dividing Christendom at the worst possible moment, a dynamic that most of us don't think about when we start looking at history. And that's close enough that some of us can trace our ancestry back that far and think, okay, how did that affect my ancestors who left Switzerland right about the time the Ottomans and headed to the area around Stuttgart, Germany, right around the time that Vienna was under siege. So, how did that dynamic play out? I don't know. I need to do more research. Anyway, thank you for taking time out. Thank you for your research and your work. Again, you're in many ways a lone voice. I know there are others who kind of tread the same path that you're on, but it's not one that's going to win you a lot of friends in the corporate media. So I appreciate what you do and appreciate you being willing to come on this little program.
No, thanks very much, Derek. I really appreciate it. It's my passion, and as you say, a lot of people there's just so much fake history, which to me is fake news, but in a more important way, because if you don't know where we come from, you don't know where we are or where we're going. But anyway, I appreciate it, and thanks for having me on.
You find links in the notes at VFTB.net, or if you're watching this at YouTube, which is our YouTube channel, youtube.com/Gilbert House, you'll find in the notes below a link to Raymond's website and a link to Raymond's new book, Defenders of the West. Highly recommended, and very interesting reading, because he draws so heavily on the source material, contemporaries of the men he's writing about. And that's a perspective, again, that we don't get in our modern or postmodern world, where there's no such thing as truth. Your truth may not be my truth. Who's to say what's true? That's a worldview that can get you killed if you're walking across the streets. Maybe there's a bus coming, maybe it's not. Maybe it's true for the driver, but not for me. Truth exists, and denying it can hurt you. RaymondIbrahim.com is his website. Go check out his regular column on ongoing Christian persecution of Christians around the world, because you won't hear it in the corporate media, but it is a thing. Christians, whether you hear about it on the news or not, the truth is Christians are the most persecuted religious group on planet Earth. Well, we got a couple of conferences coming up. In fact, one is just 1 week away as you're seeing this now. I'll be in California for the Dark Secrets and Bright Hopes Conference that begins on the 16th, September 16th through the 18th. Be there with L.A. Marzulli. Glad to see L.A. again, L.A. and Peggy. Dr. Brian Artis will be there as well. He's been very outspoken about the pandemic and various things associated with this. Pastor Dave Bryan putting this together at his church, Church of Glad Tidings in Live Oak, California. That is just north of Yuba City, which is in turn just north of Sacramento. So if you're in that area in California, please consider coming out to join us. I think there's still time to sign up. You can find out more at the website, churchofgladtidings.com, churchofgladtidings.com. And speaking of spiritual warfare, which is really what this whole conflict between Islam and Christendom is about, next month, Sharon and I will be in her old stomping grounds near Louisville, Kentucky, which is just downriver from her hometown of Madison, Indiana, which if you've read any of her early fictional work, like Winds of Evil and Signs and Wonders, The Armageddon Strain, it's really set in and around Madison. If you read Eden, Indiana, Just substitute Hanover, and you get an idea where she's writing about. Anyway, we'll be in Jeffersonville, Indiana, for an advanced spiritual warfare training workshop the weekend of October 14th, 15th, and 16th with L.A. Marzulli again, David Hevner, and it's his building, his facility where we're going to be holding this. He purchased an old church and is using it for his video production, including production of his television series, The Last Evangelist. David Hevner, Tom Dunn, Through the Black Ministries, Vicki Joy Anderson, author of They Only Come Out at Night, Sanda Allison, Tracy Tennant, and more. This is being produced by Hear the Watchman Ministries, our good friends Mike Kerr and Jeannie Moore. And we invite you to join us for this. I know Sharon's going to have some family members there, and we're really looking forward to seeing them. But we'd love to see you, too. If you're in and around southern Indiana, northern Kentucky, Louisville, southeast Illinois, it's a short hop over, relatively speaking. We hope you can join. If you're in the Cincinnati area, it's, maybe an hour and a half down, if I remember correctly, because I remember Madison's about halfway between Cincinnati and Louisville, and it's about 45 minutes either way, if I remember right. Anyway, hope you can join us. You can find out more at hearthewatchmen.com, hearthewatchmen.com. Please take advantage of our free mobile app. Get you all of our video content, this program, the 2 weekly shows that we produce for our network affiliates, Sci Friday and Unraveling Revelation, plus our weekly audio Bible study, the Gilbert House Fellowship, which is released every Sunday around noontime-ish, depending on when we get up and get going on Sundays. But you'll find all of it at our mobile app, which is absolutely free. Gets you all of that content, iOS, Android, Amazon Kindle Fire, phones and tablets. It also works on Roku. There's a Roku edition and an Apple TV version as well, so you can put it right on the big screen. But if you've got it on your mobile app and you've got a relatively recent smart TV, you can generally cast those things to the TV using Google's Chromecast or Apple's AirPlay, depending on the type of mobile device you've got. So find out more at our website, gilberthouse.org/app, and get the app there and bypass the gatekeepers of big tech, because even though we didn't get totally banned from YouTube the way Skywatch TV did, we have had programs, especially Sci Friday. There was one episode of A View from the Bunker that got yanked by YouTube. Particular guest who was very outspoken about the pandemic that got that episode pulled. But Sci Friday, we had a couple of those pulled from YouTube as well for things that we didn't even say. So bypass that, because our mobile app comes from a Christian company called Subsplash, and they've been wonderful to work with. Excellent customer service, and reliability is awesome, and they don't try to censor us. So get the app, and that way you'll always be in contact, and we truly appreciate you taking time out of your schedule to watch or listen, whether it's the app with our YouTube channel, youtube.com/GilbertHouse, or if you're listening to the audio podcast, Apple Podcast, Google Podcast, Amazon Music, iHeartRadio, Spotify, Spreaker, Stitcher, wherever else you might find us, which is, of course, wherever fine podcasts are sold. Our announcer, always tip of the hat to the inimitable D.C. Good, and A View from the Bunker is a production of Gilbert House Ministries, released under Creative Commons Attribution, Non-Commercial, No Derivatives 4.0 international license. We do this every week because we wrestle not against flesh and blood. I'm Derek Gilbert, and this is A View from the Bunker.